Yeah, I think we're on.
We are.
We do have other intros, by the way, people. We just don't really know how the Zoom and record function works. So if it becomes something of a tradition where one of us goes, "Is it working?" It's genuinely us not knowing if we're recording or not. Anyway, welcome to episode 2 of Coffee and Clausewitz, the barnacle on the bottom of the good ship scholarship.
Absolutely.
I just thought of that whilst I was having my tea.
Oh, impressive.
Yeah, you like that?
I do.
As ever, this hasn't changed since last week. My name's Harry Bezic, and I'm joined by
Barney Hagen.
And we will be guiding you through this journey, this quest to uncover the secrets that aren't really secrets because they're all in books.
Mm-hmm. But you don't want to read them, which is why you're listening to this. So we're telling you.
And you've left your phone in the other room, so you can't see Wikipedia. Hang on. How are you listening to this? What are you doing? What are you doing? Okay, this
Have they gone?
Barney, could you take over? I'm really...
Okay, yeah. Stay, children.
Right, guys, so this week we will be covering specifically tactical and operational evolutions of gunpowder and cannon in European warfare. As a quick recap to last week, we laid down a lot of background as to the social, political, and a few of the military impacts of gunpowder make its debut on specifically the European battlefield. Don't worry, everybody, we will be branching out outside Europe. Can't remember if we mentioned that last week. Yeah, I'm getting a thumbs up from my compatriot here. That's Barney, by the way. There's only there are but two of us. So this week we will be jumping down the rabbit hole, solely the military implications of gunpowder on the European battlefield. So yeah, off we go.
Okie
So,
you want me?
Yeah, because we're going to do this through three case studies. I'll just let you know. Barney's going to be talking a little bit about the siege of Antwerp, and I will be talking about the Battle of Kirchholm in 1605, the Battle of Lutzen in 1632, and we're hoping it was decided over a cup of tea a few days ago that this will give a good illustration as to the some of the impacts and effects that these new weapons,
the differences and the similarities,
different similarities, lines of continuity in warfare and changes to the composition of armies, etc., all will become, we hope, somewhat clear in the coming 20 minutes or so. So, without further ado, Mr. Barnstable, should you hit us with the siege of Antwerpen?
Yes, absolutely. Hit you with my Antwerp. Right. So.
One, isn't there?
Yeah. One is not normal. But the siege of Antwerp. There's been a lot of sieges of Antwerp. The one in particular we're looking at lasted for roughly a year, 1584 to 1585. Just a little bit of background on this situation. Antwerp was controlled by the Dutch rebels at the time, who were rebelling against the control of the Spanish, who had come into control of the Netherlands thanks to Charles V inheriting them from one of his many relatives.
I think we mentioned Charles V basically de facto taking over the whole of Europe by his network of acquaintances and a weird ass family tree.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very bizarre because
wet dream. It's Charles V.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think it's Diarmid McCulloch makes this point that Charles V becomes the most powerful man in Europe just because of who his family married.
Yeah,
it's not because of conquest, anything like that. Anyway, so Netherlands at the time are under Spanish control. Eagle-eared listeners might realize, or if they know their geography very well, that Antwerp is actually not Dutch, it's Belgian. That's because Belgium comes along a lot later as a country. It doesn't exist until the 1830s.
It's debatable as to whether it's here now, to be honest.
Very true, very true. Yeah, I'm not sure it exists. So that is,
on the off chance we have any Belgian listeners, we're only joking. We know you're real.
yeah. So, put your chips down. Anywho, so Antwerp lies on the River Scheldt. How you pronounce it?
Yeah,
and the Spanish are attacking it to take it back from the Dutch. Okay, so this particular siege has two stages to it. The first stage is what you might call the classic stage of a siege, where lines of entrenchments are dug around the castle, the fortifications, to isolate it from the rest of the world. This has the technical name of contravallation, which is, I know, which is the term that you use to describe the entrenchments that encircle the castle.
I am guessing by the fact that because the Spanish weren't able to just turn up with cannon and blow the walls down within 4.5 hours, like happened to the Italian city-states when Charles VIII rocks up in 1494, Antwerpen is defended, the approaches to or the actual city itself is guarded or defended by a Trace Italienne type fortification, so fairly low walls, just full of earth. Have they done that by 1584?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially in the Dutch Revolt, which lasts 80 years from the 1560s to the 1640s, if memory serves, is defined by siege warfare.
Right.
Antwerp lasts a year. The siege of Ostend drags on for 3 years. It's completely defined by siege. 3 years, yeah. The siege of Ostend. Yeah, they didn't manage to cut the supply lines over the sea, which is not helpful. So it was always supplied.
How did they? I know we're supposed to be talking about Antwerp, but how did they keep it? How did they keep Ostend supplied? Like, was it the
support?
Were the English sending supplies, or were the Dutch just sending supplies round?
It was both. The Dutch were sending supplies round. The English were sending supplies over. The actual reason for the Spanish Armada in 1588 is because the Spanish are so annoyed at the English continually sending supplies over the North Sea to the Dutch that they decide to take the English out to eliminate that problem for them.
Okay. Sorry. Anyway, I'm
but no, very. So this is standard how siege warfare in this era progresses. You dig your line of contravallation, so you encircle the place. Then you start firing artillery, heavy artillery at the walls to try and create a breach. So I wasn't able to find out about Antwerp itself, but if you kind of generalize from 16th century warfare, you can imagine a picture. Typically, a heavy artillery piece of this period, you would fire a shot every 6 minutes. So you'd fire the shot, you clean the cannon out, you leave it time to cool down, you push it back into place because the recoil will push it backwards, and then you will fire your shot again, and that will take you about 6 minutes.
What were the size? What were the size of the projectiles at this point? About?
Oh Lord, for heavy artillery.
Yeah.
I'm not.
Up to about 25. Up to about 25 pounds. I've read with the really heavy guns, but anything from 6 to 25 pounds.
That sounds about right. Yeah, I mean the field artillery would go down to as small as half a pound. These tiny little cannons they used to have. But that sounds about right. And in the main. So typically, depending obviously on how many guns you have, but this would typically result in 500 to 1,000 shots a day being fired into a besieged, into a besieged settlement or fort. Now, one problem with the siege warfare in the Netherlands, of course, is that it's a very wet place. So this makes it a lot more difficult to actually bombard because you're always getting your guns are getting flooded, getting washed out. They need firm ground to work on, or you have to build platforms that will rot.
Another point as well, especially if you're Antwerp specifically, if you're anywhere near that, if you're basically Antwerp, if you draw a line south from Antwerp, you are, and well, that's why it's called the Low Countries, but I think you only have to dig down a meter and a half, and you're below the water table. At some point, dear listeners, we will cover something to do with Ypres and the first.
I was about to say Passchendaele.
Yeah. So not only is the need to keep the guns firing made all the more difficult, just making any kind of approach is made all the more difficult unless you want to swim it.
Yeah.
Did you find anything about like trenches flooding and stuff?
Well, I did find something on the sort of the military use of water, if that makes sense as a term, which I'll come on to briefly. Yeah. But just to finish the point about using Antwerp to illustrate general siege warfare, although we are obviously seeing artillery being used to try and create a breach in the walls of a fort, other medieval forms of siege warfare are still ongoing. So there's still use of sapping, which is trying to dig a tunnel underneath a wall to undermine its foundations to collapse it. From the defending side, there's still the use of boiling oil being poured on people when they're attacking a breach, or rocks being just thrown onto their heads as they're running into the breach. From the attackers' side, there's even still the use of siege towers in the 1500s. It's very rare, but there's the siege of Montalcino, which I assume is in Italy. They still use siege towers at that, I think, effectively at that particular. So it's an important point to bear in mind because obviously this is every period is a period of transition, but this is a period of transition. The old methods of siege warfare are still being used. So basically, and also, as important as artillery is, it's not the preferred method of capturing a settlement. There are basically two ways you can go about it. You can create a breach and push your men through it, and anyone who's played Total War knows these two ways. You create the breach, you push your men through it, you capture the settlement.
I auto-resolve.
Oh, you auto-resolve, do you?
Yeah,
you're one of them.
That guy.
Yeah. Oh, dear. Yeah. Or the other way, of course, is wait 4 turns until they surrender. Yeah. So what this means is that the garrison has finished its food supply and it cannot fight. And the garrison and the population finish their food supply. They can't hold out any longer. They can't feed themselves. They're not physically strong enough to lift their weapons. And so they surrender. This is the preferred method. Of course, it's longer, but it saves a lot of troops' lives. To just give you an example of how extreme this could get in this time period, at the Siege of Paris in 1592, so only less than 10 years after Antwerp, the populace was reduced to eating rats, insects, shoes, and it was rumored even their own dead in order to survive. I know. The reaction is, but at the same time...
Did they have any seasoning when eating their own dead? Tell me they have.
It's Paris. It's Paris, so...
Okay, well, that's something.
Presumably they did, yeah. I just hope they didn't run out of cigarettes, because a French person without cigarettes is, frightening. But anyway, so the first stage is very much classical siege warfare. But as we mentioned, the Netherlands are the Low Countries. What did you call it, Harry? Is it the water level?
Water table.
Water table, thank you. The water table is very close to the actual surface of the ground.
You're in it.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
So the Dutch were supplied via the River Scheldt. This is how supplies were brought into the city. So what the Spanish did was they built a bridge across the river to block it. When we say bridge, it's not as in, London Bridge or something like that. It's a bridge built of boats. So
Oh,
just
pontoon
imagine
bridge.
a pontoon bridge. So boats next to each other from riverbank to riverbank, all the way across. These were anchored on either side by a fort equipped with cannon and musketeers.
Okay.
So to try and alleviate this problem, the first thing first things the Dutch did was flood the ditch by they flooded the lowlands, hoping to
Oh,
wash the forts away. Yeah, unfortunately, it didn't. What it did was isolate the forts on their little hillocks or whatever it was, but they were still viable. So they were basically turned into little islands, but they were still able to disrupt the Dutch. Excuse me, I'm just going to.
Barney's just taking a swig of tea.
I am indeed. Right. So then they tried to blow up the bridge, get rid of the bridge. And the way they did this was with fire ships.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. So the fire ships at Antwerp were known as hell burners, which is, I mean, that's a pretty good name for a rock band.
Yeah,
I
that's a
think,
good name
hell
for a
burners.
fire ship. Yeah.
Yeah. Also known as Antwerp Fire. So they were packed full of explosives. Actually, it's weirdly reminiscent of a commando raid in World War II at a place called Saint Nazaire.
Yeah.
But basically, they ran these ships into the pontoon bridge. These ships were packed with explosives on a delayed fuse,
Yeah.
which had been built into a rectangular chamber, which would direct the blast outwards, basically, onto the bridge.
Oh, okay.
So, does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, you know, I can
Yeah.
I'm just how far into the siege are we when the Spanish are launching ships to
The Dutch are launching this.
the Dutch are launching ships to at the Spanish that are just going to
We're
blow.
we're very near the end because
I hoped you'd say that because that makes me think I'm more right. That sounds like a very expensive and quite a desperate way of making warfare.
absolutely.
When
So
we're going to torch and blow up our merchant marine in order to try and break the siege.
absolutely. So I'll wait till the next bit. But so on this particular bit, so one ship is successful. It hits the bridge, it stays in place, the fuse goes off on time, the blast is heard. Bear in mind, this is 1584, 1585.
Yeah.
The blast is heard for an 80-kilometer radius around the city.
Wow.
Yeah, which just goes to show you the amount of explosives, the amount of gunpowder that's being used. And it blew up the bridge. It was successful. The only problem was the Spanish. Yeah, yeah. I mean, if it didn't, that would be interesting. Yeah. It's the old story, isn't it? Dog bites man, not interesting. Man bites dog. Yeah. But, so it was successful. Problem was the Spanish just rebuilt the bridge, and now the Dutch don't have any ships and they don't have any gunpowder.
I was going to say.
What they do have is you can't even describe it as a ship. It's better called a floating platform that was called the Finis Belli. Now, Harry, I'm sure you remember your Latin. What does the Finis Belli mean?
Well, belli is war.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I want to point out at this point, Barney went to private school. I went to state school, so we didn't get Latin.
Oh, Barney won a scholarship.
Harry didn't. No. What does the first one mean? What does the finish mean?
Okay, so finish basically means end. It's where you get finish from in English.
That's depressingly obvious now. Yeah. All right, let's move on from this.
So Finis Belli, end of war. In other words, it was considered such a powerful weapon that it would be the end of the siege. But this is what the Dutch mean by it. So it's a huge floating platform. These sources say that it has a castle at its center. Now, this is not an actual castle. What it means is a raised wooden platform at the center. It's full of artillery. The castle at the center. The rest of the platform has 1,000 musketeers on it. So we are talking about a huge construction. The sources differ on this, but it might have been protected by thick iron plates. And there are some historians who argue for this to be the first ironclad ship. So we're talking about a huge vessel, comparable to the Yamato battleship in the World War II that the Japanese had.
Are we fairly near the end of the siege when they're doing that?
Absolutely, yes. We have to assume that they've been making this for quite a while. The engineer who made it was an Italian who had defected from the Spanish service to the Dutch. He later winds up in England at the time of the Spanish Armada. So he's invented this huge platform. Problem is, it's too big. So they push it out. They push it out the wetlands to take down these. I don't know how they could even steer it, so it might have just drifted out to sea if it had worked. But they push it out into the wetlands to take down these Spanish forts, and it ran aground. And obviously, it's too heavy to just push it off, so it didn't really do much.
It didn't get stuck in the sewers.
No, not quite. Not quite. I mean, the Dutch equivalent, but not quite. But that's an interesting point, of course, because in terms of gunpowder concentration, in terms of concentration of artillery and musketeers, the weapons that are coming to dominate the battlefields of Europe, there's nothing to compare to this in this time period, and probably any time period. And yet it's completely useless, which goes to show that the weapons in and of themselves, I know you're going to bring this up, Harry, when we come on to Kirkholm, the weapons in and of themselves do not actually create the battlefield revolution. And so what Antwerp proves, what the Finis Belli shows, is that you have there's a great assumption or hope that these new technologies will override battle tactics and even the logic of battlefield. And it doesn't turn out to be the case.
Existing battlefield conditions.
Precisely, yeah. And I think that's what Antwerp shows us. So that's the so that's the Siege of Antwerp, and they were forced to surrender after a year because their supply lines had been cut. I will point out that it was the sorry, Harry.
No, it sounds like they were using an awful lot of resources on
exactly
on these types of schemes. I mean, were they?
Well, Antwerp was to put it into perspective, Antwerp at this point is the most populous city in the Netherlands. It was then in the Netherlands. It has over 1 million people in it, which in 16th century terms is huge.
Massive.
It is the cultural, economic, and financial center of the Low Countries, which at this point are still one of the richest places in Europe. I mean, you're just entering the Dutch Golden Age. They're just inventing the stock market and all that. So Antwerp is absolutely one of the most powerful cities in Europe. It's the equivalent to taking
Opal.
Sorry?
Probably the equivalent to taking Constantinople, or
but I was thinking nowadays.
Right.
If Berlin was taken, for example, it's the equivalent to that, or even London, because the financial center of the Low Countries pretty much means the financial center of Europe, effectively at this point, or it will shortly become that way. And so the population was 1 million. And it went down after the battle. There was a mass exodus of Dutch people fleeing northwards. The population went down to 400,000. So over 50% of the population left.
Wow.
Yeah.
Over how long? Over how long?
Oh, I think you're looking in about a 10-year period.
That's pretty rapid. That's
pretty rapid. Which is huge for 600,000 people to move. So that's the Siege of Antwerp. I would point out, even though we're talking about gunpowder warfare, again to show the continuity, they defeated Antwerp by starving it out, by waiting the 4 turns until they surrender. It was not an assault. They did not create a breach in the defenses. The other way of looking at it is the defenses held. However much shot they're firing into
Yeah.
these defenses over a whole year, over 12 months, the defenses held. So what we're looking at, what Antwerp shows in both in terms of attack and defense, is still in this time period, despite these new technological advances, they still can't override existing battlefield or siege conditions.
And
They're
we're
still locked in the same.
yeah, we're still quite a way away from high explosive shell being developed. This all would have been solid shot. Where are we? 1584. So what's happened? Gunpowder. We're firing iron shot. That
Yeah, we've got to that.
yeah, and we've got cast iron. We've got cast iron guns, although a lot. But yeah, so what we're saying is the arrival of this new technology. Its development was incremental and was not at any one stage able to affect a snap revolution in military affairs. It's
absolutely. Just to link it back to last week, I think it also goes to show certainly my disagreement with the McNeill thesis about Charles V. There's still the existing battle conditions. I want to call it the logic of the battlefield. It's still rooted in medieval warfare.
Yeah,
and certainly in terms of sieges it is. But what is it in terms of battles?
Well, we decided to. I'm taking over here now, everyone. I will take charge now. Yeah.
You won't hear my lovely voice anymore.
Thank heavens for that. We wanted to include two battles as case studies. I'm kind of going to be. They're going to be a bit more whistle stop than Barney's treatment of the siege of Antwerp, because we wanted to include them because the scholarship generally assigns this period in history of military history as being that one of sieges such as Antwerp, such as Paris, such as oh my God, there's too many to name. Pretty much name a city in Northwest Europe and especially in the Netherlands or in Belgium.
Absolutely.
But what we wanted to illustrate is that armies did still move, they did still maneuver, they did still fight. My case study is a little bit later. This Battle of Kirkholm was in 1605, and it was during the Polish-Swedish War, which was between 1600 and 1611. We no need to get into why this war was being fought, but it's basically about Swedish, a bellicose Sweden under Charles X, wanting to take territory in the Baltic. So Kirkholm takes place in September 1605. Charles has by far the bigger army. He has 11 or 12 guns, cannon, excuse me. He's beginning to fight a war with a mixture of musketeers and pikemen, where, how to explain it?
So would they be in separate units?
No, this is the thing, because we haven't got to the point where we've invented the plug bayonet or the socket bayonet yet, wherefore the musketeers can defend themselves against cavalry or other infantry. Okay. No, what they used to do was, and this was becoming common throughout, or more done throughout Western Europe by this time, was you'd have a block of pikemen carrying anything from a 16 to a 30-foot long stick with a spike on the end, in order to see off other pikemen or, crucially, enemy cavalry. Within this kind of almost a hedgehog type formation, you would have musketeers embedded in. So they'd almost shelter underneath the pikes. If you look at some of the diagrams, you've got the musketeers either between or kneeling down depending what the formations do, depending on what the formation's doing.
Right. Okay. So it's effectively combined arms.
Yeah, it's a good instance of an early 17th century, late 16th century combined arms. The cannon would use, depending on what the ground would usually be in front of the cavalry and would be screened, and then would be screened by cavalry if the enemy got too close.
Right.
But the Kirkholm is interesting because Charles's army is bigger, but also has a lot more gunpowder weapons, whether we're talking cannon or muskets.
It has more of both.
It has more of everything. It's a
more right.
It has more of the new. It has more of the new stuff in inverted commas, anyway.
But it has more, and it has more old stuff as well.
Yeah.
Right.
The Polish army. It's a Polish-Lithuanian army. It's only about 3,500 strong. It's not.
What size is Charles's army?
About 10,000. Sorry,
right.
Yeah,
so
that's it.
Heavily outnumbered.
Oh, big style. Yeah, it's. Hang on a second. We got it's Charles the 9th of Sweden. Sorry, not Charles the 10th.
Terrible.
Yeah, and the Polish army is about 1,000 infantry and 2,600 cavalry.
Right. So cavalry than infantry.
Yeah. And I think we briefly mentioned this last week, where gunpowder weapons begin to displace cavalry as being the shock arm of an attacking army.
And cavalry develop their own gunpowder tactic.
Yeah, but this is why Kirkholm is so interesting. We've got a Polish army that's quite cavalry heavy. The Swedes do have cavalry. They've got about how many cavalry do they have? They've got about 25. They've got about 2,500 cavalry and about 8,000 infantry, something like that.
Wow, so it's about even in terms of cavalry, and then
numerically, yeah. But
8-1 in terms of infantry.
The Swedish cavalry are equipped in the more modern style, in inverted commas, and it's commonly called the harbuskiers. It's the harbuskier style because they carried an arquebus. Hang on, harquebusier. I think that
harquebusier.
Yeah, I'm so.
Harquebusier.
If there's any actual military historians listening to this, I'm so sorry.
Or any 17th century Swedes, we highly apologize.
They'll have turned off.
Do you think once we insulted them, they're gone? Yeah.
But basically, the harquebusiers carry what is called an arquebus, which is what I suppose today we call a carbine, a small musket.
Right. Yeah.
They will also carry a mixture of, depending on where you were and who was equipping them. They'd also carry an axe and or a sword for close combat. But this is kind of the more modern style for equipping cavalry. If you think like the Roundheads in the English Civil War, that's
right. Yeah, with you. Yeah.
The Polish cavalry, as it turns out, very unfortunately for the Swedes, includes the highly trained, the winged hussar units.
Oh yeah,
the absolute.
Very cool.
Yeah, very very cool. People, if you can get onto Google and Google image winged hussar, they look sick.
So what does a hussar mean? We've got harquebusier. What's a hussar?
A hussar. Do you know what?
Is it a specific type of cavalry? I mean, if you go,
it's a type of cavalry, and it is.
I know Napoleonic. It's quite light cavalry. It's not heavy cavalry. By the time of the Napoleonic era.
Do you know what? I'm not actually sure what how they classify hussar. Because you're right. By 200 years later, by the Napoleonic Wars, it's a light, fairly light cavalry armed with a saber, maybe a pistol.
Yeah, maybe even a carbine.
Yeah.
But it doesn't sound like, I wouldn't
But
have thought a Polish winged hussar would have been the light cavalry.
no, these are heavy cavalry. These are very
Right, so these
very
are
heavy
definitely
cavalry.
heavy cavalry. Right, okay. So
But
whatever hussar means, we're
whatever
talking about
hussar
heavy
means,
cavalry.
these guys had wings, and the Polish had quite a few of them. And
And these are highly trained, or if they're not trained, highly
they are
experienced.
what we would maybe consider, to use a Western European analogy, almost they seem to be almost like knights. They're a
Right.
warfare training for warfare is a way of life for them rather than community.
Right.
So we've got these two armies, one of which, the Swedes, has far more gunpowder weapons than the Poles, and the battle only lasts about, it's decided within about 30-40 minutes, because the winged hussars go and do a massive charge into the Swedish right flank.
Right, okay.
And the Swedes are drawn up in about three lines in the blocks that I've mentioned.
That's pretty standard for that time, isn't it? That kind of deployment.
I mean, and the Swedish right just absolutely crumples under this charge.
Right. Okay.
Simultaneously, Charles IX sees this and orders his cavalry, his harquebusiers, on the left to attack the Polish right.
Right. Okay.
That goes hideously wrong as well. For the Swedes, and the retreating Swedish cavalry then go and break up the infantry formations, and the whole of Charles's army just crumples and routs.
Wow.
And the Swede, as is pretty normal for battles, well, up until and including the Napoleonic Wars, really, the Swedish lose more men in the rout when they turn around and run away, because as soon as the formations split, musketeers left out on their own are hopeless against cavalry.
Right. Yeah.
Unless they're in a cohesive formation.
Aren't much better.
Aren't much better. But
you can just ride around and get around the pike.
Exactly. But but it's an interesting case study as to the Swedish had more guns, and muskets, but they didn't have a unit with anything like the dash or the ferocity of the Polish winged hussars. So you've got the factor of esprit de corps. You got the.
I was going to say, it sounds like a massive case of morale.
Yeah,
being a major factor of this battle. Not that it's never a major factor, but
I mean,
a sudden collapse like that.
The Swedish had the elite units of cavalry as well. It's not like they turned.
Oh right, okay.
It's not like the Raiters. I think they were called the Riders.
I see.
Yep. So it's not like they rocked. I mean, Sweden was one of the foremost military powers of certainly.
Absolutely.
It was a regional
in the 17th century. Yeah. Much more powerful than Russia, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not like they just rocked up to Kirchholm not knowing what they were doing.
Although I suppose Swedish horses would be of a poorer quality than Polish ones.
Maybe, but yeah.
But still, that doesn't, on its own, explain the
potentially
course of the battle.
But moral of the story is, your new technology and your new toys don't always guarantee you victory.
Yeah.
The British and Americans have been finding this out for the last 20 years or so in various parts of the world.
Oh, the last 50, I'd say Vietnam.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
My final kind of case study to illustrate, and Barney was talking about this earlier, the process of continuity and how old methods and modes of warfare didn't just disappear with the onset of gunpowder, and even with the wider and wider spread adaptation, both institutionally and militarily, of of these weapons, and the new way everybody started to operate, and all these kinds of things. Because the Battle of Lutzen in 1632, during the 30 Years' War, also a conflict where there are innumerable engagements between armies standing toe to toe in fields. It's not all siege warfare, but we haven't got time to go into every battle of the 30 Years' War. It's 30 years long, for heaven's sake.
Yeah, that would take us certainly more time than we'd be prepared to commit.
Yeah, that's it. I just don't want to do that.
No, I think I completely agree with you.
But it's Lutzen is very important, and for one reason it stands out on its own, and that's that the Swedish king Gustavus Adolphus actually loses his life at Lutzen.
Right. Okay.
And he does so. Sorry.
No. I'm just saying. So the scene we're setting, 1632. Sweden is the military superpower of Northern Europe.
Yeah, it's
Gustavus Adolphus is considered one of the greatest generals of all time.
Yep, and he is up against the imperial troops directed by Ulrich von Wallenstein, the great.
Wallenstein, right.
Yeah, there's a couple of other there's Manson there. I can't. Forgive me, I can't remember the names of all the commanders on the field at the day, but we need.
I'll let you off.
Oh, thank you. But
Wallenstein, who was no slouch himself.
Nope. But the interesting thing is it actually centers around Gustavus's death, because his entourage goes and wanders in. He is killed in a cavalry melee after his entourage moves across the battlefield and walks and moves across the battlefield and enters the cavalry. Excuse me, enters the cavalry melee between the Imperial and Protestant.
Swedish.
And
Protestant. Sorry, yeah.
And Swedish. Well, no, it's the Swedish cavalry. No, you're right. But he's shot by an Imperial cavalry lieutenant. So we've got. So we've got a group of guys on. Group of soldiers, mounted soldiers, cavalry on horses, fighting with both swords and gunpowder weapons. So I think, just as an anecdote, it's an interesting illustration of the continuing use of bladed weapons and just getting amongst it. The way it had been 1,000, that wouldn't have looked unfamiliar to Julius Caesar. But with this mix of gunpowder weapons and the equipage of carbines, arquebuses. I keep having to. How do you say it again? Within the cavalry themselves, and the Swedish don't even get his body back. It sounds like it was
really.
They then.
So he's shot. He falls off the horse. They're in the middle of a melee.
Straight away.
It's been ridden over, I would have to guess.
It's a German elector who I can't remember the name of. Is holding onto his body, and he can't hold the body for any long. And we think
he's propping it up in the saddle.
He's propping him up, and then and then they have to retreat, and the Swedes never really forgive.
Oh wow!
The Germans for that, for just leaving Gustavus.
Just leaving him there,
on the battlefield. But
interesting.
So we've got two pitched battles in an era of what is supposed to be predominantly siege warfare. And as I said, the point of including those two case studies was just to say it wasn't all people hanging around in trenches shooting cannonballs at walls. There were still a lot of battles going on.
Oh no, absolutely. It also depends exactly the kind of terrain you're fighting over. Obviously,
Yeah.
looking at Antwerp in the Low Countries, a lot of rivers, a lot of canals. There's not much space to deploy large armies.
I
Siege
mean,
warfare is going to predominate. There's not much distance between towns.
completely. Like I live in the Netherlands, by the way, everybody, and any sort of fortress I mean, you've got Leiden down the road from me. I live in The Hague. Any fortress you go and visit, pretty much all of them have some kind of plan for utilizing the waterways. Or what they had some kind. They had some kind of schematic or plan for utilizing the waterways going into them or around them, or creating extra flood.
Yes,
in the event of a siege. It's just part of how that it was part of a network of defenses all around the Netherlands, because water obstacles just make everything, as Barney illustrated, water obstacles just make everything so much more damn difficult to move or do anything, and that doesn't change, well, ever.
Ever, yeah, absolutely.
Whether we're talking about the Netherlands in the late 16th century, or the Netherlands in 1944-45.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah. Anything?
So, I think that pretty much covers it. Obviously, we don't want to over egg the pudding in terms of continuity. The fact that gunpowder even exists is a massive change in the battlefield, but it's not in and of itself transformative of those battlefields.
I think. I mean, obviously, eventually it is, but I think
yes,
what we've been trying to say throughout this episode is that it happens incrementally. These changes and transformations in both the military institution, army makeup, tactical and operational developments. These take a long time to become. How to say it? It takes
just a long time to transform.
It takes a long time.
Paradigm.
To change to completely alter the paradigms of what had done before. These new weapons and technologies slotted in to what had gone before, rather than just completely turned everything on its head straight away.
Even at the most basic level, as we were talking about last week, the invention of the printing press is in the same era. So the actual extent to which these new tactics can be disseminated and learned, and of course in the 1500s there's an explosion of printing in terms of military tactics, manuals and so forth. But the extent to which it can actually spread and people can find out about it, I mean, information exchange was, I'd say, pretty quick in the 1500s, probably a lot quicker than you'd think if you don't know anything about the time period. But it's still obviously got nothing on today, or even 200 years after, by the 1700s.
I mean, there were Dutch military reformers in particular that were fascinated by the works of by Roman historians, and they by the Roman use of drills and formations. And they start to write what we would now call drill manuals. I don't have the literature to hand to start citing the first one, but as you say, the dissemination.
I think I might have researched that. I might have found that out. You keep talking.
The dissemination of these ideas, as you say, is made a lot easier by these technological and political developments that are happening at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. 1598 I've got, but that sounds far too late. Sure, it would have been before then.
Is it a Dutch one?
No, that might be referring to the first English one, but that still sounds too late.
The Dutch are commonly credited with beginning to author foot drill, what a modern army would call foot drill manuals, and a set and prescribed set of procedures and movements for loading, firing, moving, formation changes, etc., etc., etc. That's not
Perhaps one.
Sorry.
Sorry, no, I was just going to say one of the most important points. I've got a quote down here. When we're talking about change and continuity, the people at the time viewed it as a massive change, the new technologies.
Yeah.
I got a quote from an English soldier called Robert Barrett in 1598, and he wrote that the wars are much altered since the fiery weapons came up. So there was certainly a sense at the time.
Way with words, is that Robert Barrett?
I know, yeah, it's pretty swish, isn't it? But there was certainly a sense at the time that that warfare had absolutely changed, and we can't deny that it has. Despite the example of Kirkholm, the decline of cavalry, particularly in Western Europe,
absolutely
at this point, is irreversible, and it continues onwards. So it is an absolute change. You know, the uselessness of armor, as we were talking about last episode, the way army composition changes in terms of how centralized it is, in terms of how regular the armies become. It's a point worth making that I'm not sure we actually did last time. Oh, Harry, you might have mentioned it, forgive me. But armies they're not what we call a standing army, which is an army that exists all the time. They're very much hired for campaigning seasons. It is the Spanish Empire during the 1500s that develops a standing army, and it's not even because it wants to, it's just because it has to, because it's fighting on so many fronts at the same time that it has to keep these regiments in constant employment.
Spain or the northern Italian city-states, I think you begin to see that,
absolutely.
You start to see warfare as a profession and as a business being folded into local and the local administrative and fiscal networks. Because
absolutely.
Contracts would be entered into with captains, captains and commanders to hire this many soldiers, but the danger was always that one commander or captain would become too powerful, and thereby de facto he would have control of the whole city or state's armed forces. So they got around this by splitting up breaking up the power base, and they would enter into contracts with smaller and smaller numbers of troops that would only use. So thereby, not a single unit would become too dominant, and therefore,
a sort of Praetorian Guard situation.
Yeah, exactly, and therefore these units would rely on the city's administration for their employment, and not one overly powerful commander who could, and so it was who would then dictate terms to the city. It starts to become. It becomes the other way around, where the military is under civilian control, to use a modern term.
I suppose the classic example of this from this period, I know because I've studied it briefly, is the Swiss Guard under the Pope in the sack of Rome in 1521. So if you've ever been to the Vatican, and you'll notice the people stood there in their strange little uniforms, the yellow and purple stripes with the tin helmets on. This is the Swiss Guard, who were mercenaries hired by the Pope to protect him when the army of Charles V besieged Rome, and they broke in to attack the Pope, and the Pope fled to the Castle San Angelo, which is pretty much impregnable, or it certainly was back then. And the Swiss Guard fought to delay his, to buy time for his escape against the might of the Imperial Army, outnumbered over 10-1. They were pretty much killed to a man in this particular battle. So that's why the guards at the Vatican still have those funny uniforms from about 500, well, exactly 500 years ago from this year. So that's the classic example of what we're talking about,
Well,
where the civilian powers control this military force.
I think that's actually a good note to wrap this up on, because next week we're going to be doing naval warfare, where you think waging land warfare is expensive. Wait till we get to naval warfare, because we are going to be including some institutional some of the institutional developments that had to take place in order to fight to scrape together the cash to make a war in the first place. Don't get me wrong, we're still a long way from central banks where governments could just borrow the money. Warfare seems to follow a pattern of raise an army, go bankrupt, and everybody deserts 6 months later. But yeah, next week's episode on naval warfare, we're gonna one of us will be covering some institutional developments on
Absolutely.
who controls militaries and who pays for them and how they're paid for.
Yeah.
Right,
Okay.
Well, I think we covered a bit of ground there.
Yeah, just about, I'd say.
You have been listening to episode 2 of Coffee and Clausewitz. Thank you ever so much for tuning in again. And
yeah, thank you.
Yeah, we will see you next week.
Absolutely.
Ta-ra.
Ta-ta.